atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to the Politics Guys, presents the U.S. Constitution. The main Politics Guys is a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. What we're now also bringing you are in-depth series on topics in American politics and policies. Our Politics Guys Presents series will dive deeply, 1 week at a time, into a particular element of U.S. politics. In the Politics Guys Presents the U.S. Constitution, I, Dr. Trey Orndorff, and my co-host, Dr. Ken Katkin, will be diving into the U.S. Constitution, article by article, clause by clause. This multi-year project was originally only for supporters, but is now generally available to you, the listening public. If you like these shows, remember that the Politics Guys are presenting other topics right now to supporters. So head down to the show notes to get access to all of the Politics Guys and now all of the Politics Guys Presents series. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy yourself as you join me and Ken Katkin on our journey through the U.S. Constitution.
Hey, Trey, it's great to be back.
No, I mean, it's always weird. We do these shows almost sequentially, and so we're thinking about the different topics, and so it's fun to kind of gears as we move into this. But what you and I have been doing for these midweek shows for a number of weeks now, I mean, all the way back into last year, is we've been going through the Constitution. Listeners said, hey, go through the Constitution, kind of break it down. And I was really kind of excited about that, but we both kind of wondered, how long is everybody going to put up with us?
It's a big concept. It does fit in a pocket, but it's still a lot to talk through.
I mean, it's good that we're not doing the Indian Constitution, right? That'd be like a 10-year project. It'd be a voyage. I don't know. And so what we're doing this week is we're going to be introducing and getting into Article 2. So I just want to kind of set everybody up. And so we started with the preamble of the Constitution. Well, really what we started with was the origins of the Constitution. We talked about the origins of the Constitution. We talked about why we get the Constitution that we do. Then we moved into the preamble, and then we spend a lot of time in Article 1, because that's a lot of where the action of the Constitution is happening with the power of government. We talked about why that is. What we're going to start doing this week is getting into Article 2, which is dealing with the presidency. And that's what we're going to be taking on this week. Let's get into that in just a moment. So, Ken, I was excited that we were getting to Article 2. I mean, I love Article 1. I love Congress. But of course, my scholarly background is I'm a presidential scholar, right? And so I always tell my undergraduates, we teach, we can't quite, I don't have 1,000 professors. It's a smaller university that I teach at. And so we teach a presidency and Congress class. And so when I say we, I mean me. And because as soon as I had the seniority to do that, that was going to be mine, right? But I always had to tell my students, I'm like, look, I'm not going to neglect Congress, but I'm not going to spend all my time on Congress either, because I want to do some presidency stuff. So I kind of feel similarly here. The American presidency it's a unique, it's an unusual presidency. And in that sense it's really, for the country, we talked about this early on. In our country's first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, we didn't create an executive, explicitly because executive power at that juncture was being equated to the tyranny of George III, right? Rightfully or wrongfully, that's where that's being connected to. But then after the Revolutionary War, we begin to see that lack of an executive as a flaw. And so you get founders like Alexander Hamilton, who think that executive power is not just compatible with, but even necessary for a functional republic, or as he and other framers would have put it, the president is designed to give energy to the Republican system. Now, not everybody's convinced, right? So for many, this idea of the executive Article 2, this is a even more contested portion of the Constitution. Others thought that executive power is not compatible with republicanism at all, right? To have an executive is to kind of to miss out on the importance of Congress. And so the revolutionaries of 1776, they saw the Declaration of Independence as that embodiment of good government, and, they're leery. So you have this really complicated desire about what should happen in Article 2. And the other element here, we mentioned this a little bit back when we were introducing the Constitution, was, of course, the guy who's presiding over everybody who's writing the Constitution is looking at the guy who's presiding, George Washington, and going, here's the guy, right? Here's the guy. And I don't think there's any historians or political scientists who would have disagreed that we probably would have ended up with a slightly different Article 2 had Washington not been presiding and everybody in the room been nearly unanimous that he ought to be holding one of those roles. As a matter of fact, even at the time, Monroe writes to Jefferson in France, telling him, hey, just let you know, we gave a lot of leeway, in his words, to the creation of the president because, in his word, it's assumed it will be Washington, end quote, right? So we even have that contemporary account that Article 2, it's probably a little more robust than what we might have thought in other ways. But at the same time, and this is what I think makes it unique, is that Article 2 is broadly written, and as a result of that broadly written nature has led to a lot of controversy over what the actual limits and important elements of Article 2 is. So before we start getting into like the very first portion of Article 2, what are your kind of thoughts on Article 2 as a whole? We did the same thing for Article 1, so I wanted to kind of give it that same position.
I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned the Articles of Confederation, because I think exactly as you said, the framers by and large thought that although we needed federal law and we needed a Continental Congress because there's certain objectives like establishing an internal free trade zone in the United States or protecting the common defense, there's certain things that needed to be coordinated on a national level. But I think they still thought that if you build up a big administration in Washington capable of enforcing federal law, that administration is going to have the capability of turning itself into a dictatorship, tyranny, and you really don't want that. And it's better to just rely on the state and local governments to enforce the federal laws rather than creating some federal arm that can enforce federal laws. But they did find during that experience with the Articles of Confederation that those central objectives for which the national government was created, protecting the common defense and establishing an internal free trade zone, that government under the Continental Congress was just too weak to achieve those goals. That there was a lot of balkanization of the economy. States were fighting trade wars against each other. The Revolutionary War itself, was organized very haphazardly. And although everybody loved the job that George Washington did as commander in chief in the Continental Army, they knew that he didn't have a system that was capably able to supply him with soldiers, with resources, things like that. So they needed a stronger executive. One of the biggest debates at the Constitutional Convention was whether they should have one single president or whether they should have like three co-presidents. And
two would have to agree.
Yeah, two would have to agree to get anything done. And the third, even the one who didn't agree would be allowed to run to Congress and say, look, you need to change the law to not let these two do this terrible thing. And and so they were thinking that an executive triumvirate would be a way of some checks and balances within the executive. But George Washington himself spoke against that, and he said in his study of Roman history, he'd learned that Rome had two different triumvirates, and both times that landed up with one killing the other two. He didn't think it was a great system, and so they ended up being persuaded by him that a single executive would be. But one of the main checks and balances, they were still concerned about checks and balances quite a bit. And one of the main checks and balances that they did codify in our Constitution was that although they gave the president a vice president, they actually did not create any other parts of the executive branch in the Constitution. So the idea was that would be Congress's biggest check and balance against a president. There's only so much tyranny a president could get up to if he's got to do it all with his own hands or with the help of his vice president. And so if Congress trusted him, they could give him an administration. And if they were worried about him, they could shrink his administration.
Exactly. Well, and so when I think about it, and you're hitting at a lot of them, I think there's kind of, it's, again, this is a simplification, but there's kind of four major areas that they're thinking about, right? As you've already mentioned, is it an individual or a council? And that kind of gets decided. Now, the second big one that's going to be in here is how should be presidents selected and elected? That's a huge one. And we've talked about it a lot of different ways on the show sometimes. And then the third question is going to be, how long should presidents remain in office, and how does that overlap or doesn't overlap with Congress? And then, of course, maybe the biggest of all of them, what's the actual scope of that president's power? As a matter of fact, one reading of the reason we get presidents the way that we do is, Hamilton effectively kind of floats what almost seems to be this ridiculously powerful system. And one historical reading of that is he's trying to kind of make it, that seems so, wow, this could be on the table, that you could have a more presidency-centered, compromise, if you will, right? Hamilton argued that presidents ought to be elected for life. And he kind of pops that out there to do that. And then, of course, just like we talked with Article 1, and, I guess as listeners think about this, it's hard to overemphasize this, but at the same time, I know it sometimes can be frustrating when you're thinking about the selection election process. Can't think about it without thinking about slavery,
Right.
And what's happening in the states at that juncture. So anything else on that kind of broad before we start reading through the Constitution?
No, I think that sort of sets the stage for it. And today we're only going to do Article 2, Section 1, right?
Yeah, that's what we're going to focus on.
So
here.
the scope of the president's power, they're mostly going to have to wait until
Yeah, exactly. Next time. Yeah.
The others we can definitely talk about now.
Well, let's take a break here for just a moment. When we come back, we're going to start getting right there into Section 1. Okay, so Ken, let's go ahead and just start reading through Section 1. So Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution says, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Well, let's talk about that a lot, of course. He shall hold his office during the 4 years, and together with the vice president chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the number of whole senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed elector. The elector shall be, and then we're going to pause there because, in fact, that next phase that we'll start to get into is, in matter of fact, radically amended, right? Because of some issues that we're going to need to talk about. So, I think that the place to really start, again, maybe I'm giving my bias as a presidency scholar, is you wouldn't think that first phrase, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America, that's a wildly important portion of the Constitution, because initially is probably most likely viewed as a statement of fact in the sense, Congress has congressional power, the president has presidential power, but maybe it is a vesting clause, is what we call it today, meaning that the president might have some inherent executive powers that are not necessarily listed out later on in Article 2. So start us off there.
Yeah, this is probably going to sound like kind of dense verbiage at first, but I hope to make it as simple as possible. But
I'm giving you some defense here. It's dense stuff. It's important, but it's dense.
So that phrase, the executive power, it's the executive power that shall be vested in the president of the United States. That's a different verbal formulation than what was used in Article 1, Section 1. So,
yes, which is a lot of some of the arguments sometimes for why it's a specific grant. So
right. Article 1, Section 1 says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress. So that language, all legislative powers herein granted, I think really makes it crystal clear that Congress is only getting the powers that are herein granted.
Primarily Article 1, Section 8.
The list of enumerated powers. Whereas Article 2, Section 1 says the executive power shall be vested in a president. And so people have asked the question, well, does that only mean the enumerated powers, which are going to be enumerated in Article 2, Section 2? Or is there just some independent concept of, does every nation have executive power of the nation? And that's what's being vested here in the person of the president. And so that might have some independent content. And that has been a continuous debate throughout American history. I think the modern take on that, which largely comes from the Youngstown Steel case, is that there's the United States of America itself has inherent executive power. And that power is vested in the person of the president. So the president can sometimes go beyond his other enumerated powers and beyond the statutes that Congress has enacted to do things like respond to emergencies, because responding to an emergency would be part of the executive power that a country would have to have. If a country couldn't respond to an emergency, then the country would be destroyed by the emergency.
And there's nothing.
Yeah. And so if the country can respond, well, how is that? Well, it's because that executive power is vested in the president. So
and that even goes beyond Youngstown Steel. I mean, the early portions of that comes from President Lincoln, effectively saying that this power even includes the ability to potentially suspend other portions of the Constitution.
Yeah.
Right? So he kind of takes a much kind of further view of that. But you're right, that's not necessarily the modern conception.
Yeah, Lincoln. Yeah, so he said he should enforce. Should he enforce every law and therefore let the country be destroyed, or should he enforce all the laws but one so that he can save the country? And something that maybe Biden will be echoing soon when we hit the debt ceiling. But so there's that. So the executive power, I think, largely has been taken by modern Supreme Court, at least, to mean that the president has a little bit of power to take action when the country needs action to be taken. And that may go beyond his other enumerated powers.
But now contemporary presidents, kind of starting with Reagan, have even sometimes taken that a step further. And we sometimes call those the unitary president's theorist, who argue that there's maybe even a bigger bundle of items that are included here in this phase. We've never had a chance to actually talk about that,
I think
that particular one.
Unitary executive theory, I would have rooted it in the words president rather than in the words the executive power, right? Yeah. So the idea would be, since the executive power is vested in a president, that's one person, right? So one person would be unitary executive, right? So that is a theory. There's a question, and that largely comes up in the sense, I think, of how much Congress can assign powers and duties to other agencies in the executive branch that are not directly supervised by the president. So for instance, today it's somewhat commonplace to think, we've all been watching that the Federal Reserve Bank might raise the interest rates or might lower the interest rates to deal with inflation. Well, Congress by statute gave them the authority to do that. The president doesn't directly supervise that. And so sort of strong proponents of the unitary executive theory, which would not include majorities of the Supreme Court, would say, well, if the president ordered them to raise or lower the interest rate, they would have to do that because they're basically executing laws of the United States, and only the president can execute the laws of the United States. So if there's people below the president, but in the executive branch, since he's the one that has all the executive power invested in him, he has the power to direct all executive activities.
Well, since we did it in the major show, that might be a better even example. The EPA is oftentimes one of those, right? To what extent can presidents, you might think of it as reaching down and saying, look, you need to push it in this particular direction. And why? Because I'm your boss.
Yeah. I mean, so within the actual administration, the EPA actually is a single-headed agency. It's headed by an administrator, and we typically think that the single-headed agencies are more subject to presidential control,
right?
Whereas the thing like the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve
are not.
Yeah, they're not. They take action by a vote, and under the statutes that authorize them, when they vote, their vote has legal effect. So, and in fact, they have terms longer than the president. So some of them are holdovers.
Yeah, let's see, I don't even remember their terms right off the top of my head. How long is
like 6 years or 8 years?
Something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. So and so there's always political diversity within the governors, and so that would be more of a for people who believe in a unitary executive theory, they would generally say that if the president would order that the interest rate be different than what the Board of Governors says, he must have the constitutional authority to do that because they are executing laws, and all execution of laws should be vested in the president. The court has I would say the modern conservative court probably has more sympathy for that view than most courts have had, but they have not yet declared the Federal Reserve Bank unconstitutional, like that. We still have a lot of multi-headed agencies in the government that Congress created by statute, and Congress authorized them to take actions by vote, and those actions have legal effect. So all of that is inconsistent with a unitary executive.
Well, as before we continue to kind of move forward here, we need to take a moment and just kind of end our preview Okay, so Ken, we were talking about the vesting clause there. The next here is he shall hold his office during the term of 4 years and together with the vice president be chosen by having this complicated apportion of electors. So we're not going to directly elect the president. We're not going to even have, one of the possibilities was to have Congress or maybe some combination of Congress elect a president in more of a quasi-parliamentary style, we might say. It's something that you and I have talked about and bantered back. Instead, we have this other body that's going to be elected originally by state legislatures to do this. And it's a weird one. And it's not really a complicated one as to why. I mean, there's a number of different reasons it helps out on, but there's kind of a central driving reason. And we get it from Madison himself. He outlines it. He's like, look, yeah, direct elections, that would have been cool. Problem, we have slavery. And so direct election is impossible, Madison says. Again, there's some other reasons, but that's one of maybe the biggest of the motivating reasons among the framers is we've got to be careful about this.
Yeah. Put a finer point on what you're saying in case not everybody quite understood it. Virginia, which is where most of the founding fathers were,
which is a slave
state.
Yeah.
And if they weren't going to let the slaves vote. So if you had a one person, one vote system, Virginia would be a small state.
Yeah. Well, because most of them aren't voters as a result.
Right,
yeah. I mean, let's even make it clear, right? The African American population, or that junk. I mean, it's difficult. The African American population, it's a slippier slope at that moment. It far outweighs the number of free whites.
Free whites. Yeah. And so Virginia wanted to. I mean, if they had a one person, one vote system, and they wouldn't have let slaves vote, then all the free states are going to have more votes than all the slave states. Instantaneously, yeah. And that's what their concern was. They wanted, the total human population of Virginia was similar to the total human population of New York. And they wanted both states to be, similarly represented in a presidential election. But New York would have had a lot more representation if they were letting everybody vote.
So, yeah. Well, and we talked about that in terms of Article 1. That's the reason why slave states wants to have this very complicated verbiage for why we're going to have persons who aren't persons be counted at a ratio, because even then you want that representation of Congress. So this is how it comes out in the presidency.
Right. Yeah, and so they get the Electoral College, and also they have a debate at the convention about, should the state legislatures just appoint the electors, or should there be elections? And they actually stay neutral about that, and they say whatever the state legislators want. If you've got a state where the state legislatures want to appoint the electors to the Electoral College without holding a public election for president, they can do that. And if they want to hold a public election, they can do that. And from day one, almost all the states held public elections, but not all. It took until I think the 1840s or 1850s before.
Yeah, because even when you have John Quincy Adams running, you still have a number of states that are even that point. The electors are being selected by state legislatures. Yeah.
So that's basically that, and then the Electoral College that we get. So either the legislators themselves appoint electors, or there's a public election. And then whichever presidential candidate the public in a state selects, then electors for that candidate get appointed. But that's why we have this weird thing of the Electoral College.
Now, so where we kind of stopped ourselves a minute ago then is we have this long passage that deals with, well, how are electors going to vote? And I'm going to try to read this briefly, but then
it's been amended by the 12th.
But I kind of thought I might just sum it up.
Okay.
Right? That was that's right. And so effectively, what ends up happening is the idea is that electors aren't going to be voting for vice president; they're just voting multiple times with a few stipulations for president. And the thought being is, okay, well, look, the guy who's gets the most votes, he's obviously the best qualified. And the person who should be kind of waiting in the wings is the second most qualified, the runner-up. So the vice president's going to be the runner-up, right? So as I always tell my students, it'd be, imagine if Biden was still the president of the United States, but then Trump was his vice president, the second most qualified person in the country.
Yeah.
Now, there's this that's what that next passage is dealing with. But instead of reading all of that, what I thought might be a little more interesting is to tell the story. Well, why does that get amended so rapidly with the 12th Amendment? And that's the election of 1800. And I don't know how many people know about this. It's really important to understanding what happens with presidential elections. That mode of election, it doesn't last long because
the first contested election is 1796, Adams against Jefferson. And
exactly.
Adams defeats Jefferson, who becomes his vice president. And Jefferson thinks the vice president has only one job, and that's to undermine the president.
So, so you get Washington unanimously twice, then you get Adams. Then you have the vice president running against the president.
Who he ran against the previous time.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the election. So this is our, your fourth presidential election where you have the election of 1800.
Yeah.
And this is where things get crazy. I love this, right? This is my favorite. So what ends up happening is so Jefferson is running against his president, which is already a little awkward in our minds.
Who already ran against once.
Who he has been just attempting
to undermine the whole entire time.
Exactly. Yeah. Again, it would have been a lot of fun. But then, he beats Adams easily. The problem, though, is that he and his vice president, just a wonderful gentleman named Aaron Burr, they end up tying. Now, this is important to recognize because, again, this is kind of the summation here. You can tie in presidential elections without having an actual mathematical tie. You just need nobody to have a majority of the electors. But in this particular case, they get an actual tie, right? So they get the exact same numbers of votes. And so Jefferson, he kind of thought, okay, well, Burr is just going to go, okay, I was meant to be the vice president. I'm going to defer. And Burr basically lets it be known to Jefferson, hey, look, I'm looking at the scoreboard, man. We're tied.
Yeah.
Let's see where this plays out. Let's see where this goes. Now, what a lot of individuals don't know, though, is that, and we'll talk more about this as we get to that portion of Article 2, right? You don't just have a vote. Like, how do you break a tie? Well, the answer is it gets thrown to the House of Representatives, but it can't be normal, right? You vote by state.
Yeah, each state's delegation gets one vote.
Exactly. So that means so here, we're sitting in Kentucky right now. So all the Kentucky House representatives would have to get together, have a conversation, and then cast one vote from among all of them. And so, they're both coming in. So what ends up happening here, though, is, and this is where the story even gets great. This would have been fascinating in social media era, right? So it heads to the House of Representatives to do this. Well, what ends up happening, but the states tie between Jefferson and Burr, right? And, and so they talk about it some more and they vote again. And they tie, and they talk about it some more, and they tie, and they keep tying, and they keep tying. As a matter of fact, they take 36 ballots. So, I mean, there might be some, we were talking about, are they going to get things done when it comes to the debt ceiling? It might not be all that old. Who's going to be the next president? As a matter of fact, for those of you who like to do some history stuff, I don't know if is this your area? I love you reading this area.
Me too.
Adams, he even starts kind of sending out feelers going, what do I do if they haven't selected another president? He's a little nervous about this. We've got some evidence, which is fascinating too. So finally, what ends up happening is that to swing a particular state, one individual, he's not going to vote for that scoundrel Jefferson, but he doesn't want Burr in office. So he just doesn't show up so that his state can switch over. And so Jefferson wins.
Right.
But that leads to the passage of the 12th Amendment.
Where we now have the vice president run on a ticket.
Yeah, right. So today they run as a slate. So we still have electors, but now they're casting one dedicated vote for a president and one dedicated vote for a vice president. And that's what we call kind of our modern electoral college, right? So prior to the 12th Amendment, you have this possibility. It only lasts, until Jefferson and Burr. But that's what we get here, and that's what's being changed by the 12th Amendment. Anything we should add there, Ken?
One thing that actually stays that didn't get changed by the 12th Amendment, that's part of Article 1, Section 1, Clause 3, and it's still in there, has to do with the residency of the president and the president.
Yes.
Yeah.
Walk us through.
So it's commonly said that the president and the vice president can't be residents of the same That's a simplification though of what it actually says. So the clause says when the electors meet in their respective states to cast their votes, either the president or the vice president can't be an inhabitant of the same state as the elector. So like if we were in Kentucky and the Kentucky electors are casting, it wouldn't matter if if you had if both the president and the vice president were from New York, they could cast for them. But the New York electors couldn't cast for them.
Right.
They'd have to cast for only the president and not cast for the vice president. So I think the impetus for this was that the framers wanted the president and the vice president to be from different states, but the rule's not quite as strict as that. And this did come up. There was some when Bush and Cheney got elected. Cheney kind of pretended that he still lived in Wyoming, but that was known not to be true. And he'd been, directly, running. The last job he did when he started running for vice president was he was the CEO of Halliburton. So he'd been living in Texas, for like the last 8 or 9 years, which is exactly where Bush lived. And so this potentially could have been an issue, but everybody just said that he was from Wyoming. So that went through.
Yeah. It was one of those cases, unlike Santos, this was one of those cases where it was more of a, let's just make this easy.
Yeah. But in principle, the Texas Electoral College
should have only voted for Bush.
For Bush, and they should not have voted for Cheney.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that this kind of might help us understand and think about is the extent to which we mentioned this way back when we started this off. The idea that we didn't want to have parties in the American system, right? Nowhere is it more explicit than in the pre-12th Amendment Article 2. This idea, we're not going to have parties, we're going to have the best candidate and then the second best candidate.
Right.
And that lasts for 0 elections, right? And I oftentimes see this as kind of being this, and this is a schizophrenia that's not new to the United States. We both hate parties, but we can only operate with parties, right?
And we're very partisan.
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, and Washington's a great example of this, right?
Yeah.
He writes, and it gets brought up ad nauseum, to be real honest. In his farewell address, Washington has this whole line about, the worst thing that can be for electoral versions of government is parties. But of course, the first 2 parties form in his cabinet and he's taking sides, right? It's not like he's not partisan,
right.
But he wants to have that kind of external face of parties are terrible, while at the same time he's taking place in that party system. And I don't say that to take a shot at Washington, but just to say, I think that's emblematic of our American. We want to both be able to say, man, parties are terrible. I hope the other guys lose.
And that's why they so quickly go to the 12th Amendment and recognize that the president and the vice president should actually be aligned with each other. Exactly. In other words, should be in a party together.
You don't want to have Thomas Jefferson doing everything he can to undermine another Adams.
Right.
And we get this.
Burr, by the way, did even more to undermine Jefferson. He actually went and plotted with the King of Spain that if this King of Spain would help Burr establish a separate country out in what's now Utah, if he could use it as a staging ground to attack the United States later.
Well, there's a couple of really good contemporary books on that, if anybody's interested, because it's kind of the combination of our favorite things. It's constitutional law, early American history, and then conspiracy, espionage. Espionage and conspiracy.
And Burr went ahead and killed Hamilton for good measure.
Just for the fun of it, isn't that the case? That wasn't part of a conspiracy.
No, that wasn't.
Burr is such a fascinating character in history. I love teaching him. He, I don't know. Absolutely.
He and Ted Cruz and I all have one thing in common with each other.
Which is
graduates of Princeton University.
What does this tell us about Princeton? I don't know, sir. Should what how are you at about 10 yards with a weapon? Should I be worried? I mean, we're really close. So if we ever have a duel, it'll be pistols at dawn or something you can't see. Okay. So, I mean, it's worth pointing out that we have the president, they now run as the ticket. The 12th Amendment changes this, and it is a concession to the existence of parties. As we noted, nowhere in the Constitution do we actually use that term party. And really outside of the amendments to it, it itself attempts to mitigate parties, although those portions fail.
Yep.
And they fail spectacularly and they fail quickly. So, and then, the next portion of this, that Article 2 moves into is the qualifications for the president. Or am I missing something?
You skipped the time, and the time of choosing.
Oh, please read that portion. Read that portion.
It's important for just one reason. So Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, and this shall be the same through the United States. That actually has some contemporary relevance because the concept there was that although they gave the states the choice about whether they wanted to have popular elections or whether they wanted to let the state legislatures appoint the electors, the one thing they didn't want was for a state to say, well, we'll have a popular election, but if it doesn't come out the way we want, we'll have the state legislature correct it. Which is
that doesn't sound familiar at all.
Yeah, it doesn't sound familiar at all, right? That's the modern fake elector scheme, right?
Yeah.
But that's like literally what's being addressed here. So the Constitution says, the states can decide for themselves how they want to do this.
The mechanism.
The mechanism. But they all have to do it the same day. They can't wait and see what happens and then change it afterwards, right? And Congress is supposed to set election day, and Congress has always had statutes that do that, and it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November.
Well, and if you want to know about maybe some of the not quite as nefarious reasons for that, just take a look at primaries. Imagine the first versus second mover advantages you have in those scenarios, and the idea here is you don't get to do that, which I have always thought would lend credence to not having drawn out primaries.
Just having them all in the same.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's only the general election that's governed by this clause, but I think some of the principles you're talking about.
Yes. The idea, because again, if you can see what others do, it changes and alters what happens in those electoral processes in a way. Heck, today, because of the speed of communications, we even sometimes wonder, is what happening on the East Coast affecting what's happening in Central Mountain and Pacific? Now add weeks and months when we're talking about primaries.
Right.
And, those effects, we know they're real.
Yeah. It's a qualifications. That's where you want to be next.
So the qualifications, no person except a natural born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of the president. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have attained the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident within the United States. And so this actually kind of lines up with some of the work that we were doing in Article 1. There's kind of this gradual shifting or increasing of the stringency of the requirements as you move from the House to the Senate and then from the Senate to the presidency. So, the president is the only who has to be a natural born citizen, which leads to some unique legal questions in and of itself, because in the modern conception of this, there's kind of two paths to that natural born, right? Either you have one of your parents is a citizen, which confers upon you citizenship, or you're born in the territory of the United States, which confers upon you a citizenship. And the modern, to give back to somebody, you have a commonality, which Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz actually ended up with, he didn't want it necessarily, but he had dual citizenship because he was, I'm going to do this right. He's born in Canada, but his parents are both American citizens.
His father was I don't know when his father was naturalized. It may have been only his mother that was.
I thought by the time he was born, they were both.
I
think it was both.
Yeah.
Because remember he kind of famously renounced his Canadian citizenship. I didn't really, who cared? But
Right. Yeah. So I think normally birthright citizenship or either because of being born on the soil of the United States or because of parents. That was always one of those things when the anti-Obama people, the birthers, would claim falsely that he was born in Kenya, which he wasn't. But
even it wouldn't have mattered.
It wouldn't have mattered. His mother was very obviously American, and he would have been a natural born citizen anyhow.
Well, for a while there was a group of individuals who argued that of course the Constitution didn't mean that, right? The natural born had to be location, but of course there is no basis to that at all. That has long been the practice,
right? I mean, I do think they've all been born in. They have all been born in the United States. Even George Washington and John Adams were.
When what we now think of as the United States, of course.
They're born on the territory.
Yeah.
Because I think that thing about the catch-all that you read about anyone, you have to be a natural born citizen or you have to be a citizen at the time of the adoption of this Constitution.
Exactly.
Yeah, there was a concept that, exactly as you said, first of all, none of this was the United States when they were born. But second, it would have been okay even if they'd been born in England then, as long as they were citizens by the time the Constitution was ratified.
Exactly, had been here.
Yeah.
Which is a bigger... Now, the other one here that sometimes gets overlooked, this idea of the 14 years a resident within the United States, right? The idea here is that you didn't want somebody who had just, okay, I'm a citizen, but I've been hanging out in France, or I've been hanging out in France too long. I've been hanging out in the United Kingdom too long, and so I'm not American anymore.
Yeah.
We wanted to kind of make sure that they had re-assimilated, might be a way. I mean, I think that's a fair way of putting that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And the 35 years age, and this is at a time when average life expectancy probably wasn't even 60. So that was pretty old.
Right. And the oldest of all three of the elected branches, because we don't get anything. Obviously, we'll talk about Article 3 down the line.
Yeah.
But there are no ages attached to anything with Article 3. So, okay. So what part of this should we move to next?
Next would be this is another one that's been amended, but that what happens if a president dies or resigns.
Oh, true.
And that's amended by the, I'm going to have to, my numbers.
Let's see, that is
26th?
25th.
Yeah. So after the Kennedy assassination. Yeah.
To be clear, it's not because I'm smarter than Ken. I just had more notes. I have more notes.
So the Constitution has always said that if the president dies or resigns, then the vice president becomes president. In fact, that's one of the only jobs of the vice president. But what it didn't used to say until the 1960s is, do we get another vice president if that happens? And the answer was always no. So we had a number of times in American history where vice presidents assumed the presidency, and then we didn't have a vice president anymore. But now we have a process where the new president can nominate someone to be his vice president, and if the Senate confirms that person, we can replace a vice president.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, so in the 25th, I guess I think of this as being more recent than it was.
Yeah.
It's really a response to the assassination of JFK.
Okay, exactly. Yeah.
Because the previous examples were, before JFK.
Well, Lincoln was assassinated. McKinley was assassinated.
Yeah, I mean, she had to go all the way.
Garfield was assassinated.
Wouldn't Garfield, isn't he going to be the most recent assassinated?
McKinley, I think, is later than Garfield.
I think
you're the president.
Yeah, I should have this in top of my head. Now I'm sitting here.
I believe McKinley was 20th century, but just barely, maybe 1901.
Okay. Yeah. So, but yeah, that again, that's the impetus for this shift. Is you're right, because then what happens if we had another? What happens if we lose the vice president now as president?
Yeah. And that actually did happen after we got a 25th Amendment, but not before. So when we lost Agnew and then we lost Nixon, both to resignation.
Right.
So when Agnew resigned, because we had the 25th Amendment, Nixon was able to nominate Ford to become his vice president, and then Ford got confirmed by the Senate. And then Nixon resigned. So Ford makes it all the way to the White House without ever having been elected to anything higher than Congress.
I can't remember who becomes Ford's vice president.
Rockefeller.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. But he had to do the same thing. Yeah. So we start using the 25th Amendment quite a lot during that little flurry of activity.
Yeah. Can you admit it would have been almost a crisis?
Yeah. Because in fact, the Presidential Succession Act, the statute, which is not part of the Constitution.
It's later than that.
Well, we've had it before that, but it makes the Speaker of the House third in line. And many people say that's unconstitutional because it's an interbranch appointment. So we would have had a constitutional crisis over that.
No, and that's actually never happened, but it has come up. That I don't know. I don't think the court would strike that down. What do you think?
I think they.
Okay.
I think they'd give it to the Secretary of State. Yeah, I think this modern court, is pretty, likes the separation of powers, and I think they'd say you can't have an interbranch appointment, and especially if this would, I guess now maybe they would let McCarthy take over because they're partisan. But if it had been the other way around, if Trump had been president and Nancy Pelosi was in line, they never would have let him take it. So it's. We better keep moving because I have to go soon. So, the presidential pay comes next, and that really just says two things. It says he's paid by the U.S. Treasury, and he can't have a pay cut or a pay raise during his term of office, and also he can't get any emoluments, and that came up a bit during the Trump administration, I guess. So emoluments could mean a few things, but one of the meanings would be getting paid by somebody else, or being granted a title by somebody else or something like that.
Or potentially kind of earning money as a result of being the office.
Of being in the office, exactly.
Now, the portion there at the beginning is important. I know that one of the things that we've talked about recently is, well, why don't presidents just, why do they have to have a salary? Why they do that? But one of the ideas of having a presidential salary, although the modern presidential campaign makes this a little wonky, was the idea, well, you don't want it just to be people who are rich, right? The idea here was there's a paycheck, and therefore an average-ish person could run and not go bankrupt in the process of living.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that we kind of even see with other executive branch offices, like in the Washington, so Washington's getting paid, the first individuals to go overseas, again, going back to Adams II, is, how am I supposed to live over here in court if I don't have a salary that makes that happen? We overlook that, but that was a big deal at the time to say, well, look, we want these individuals paid. Yeah, and we see that as being a negative. They saw that as being as positive.
Positive, yeah. Not only because it would democratize the offices and let people who aren't rich do them, but also because it would a little bit of a barrier against corruption. Because if you also don't want it only to be available to people whose friends are rich and are willing to give
exactly. Yeah. But again, that kind, as the process for being elected has strung out, and as we've had the modern primary process, that the importance of that has obviously
there's
diminished.
A lot of money in politics now.
Yeah. A ton of money. And then obviously moving forward from that, finishing off section 2 is the oath of office, where it says, before he entered on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation, and it gives the actual words. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, end quote. This is an interesting piece, and I don't honestly have a good answer, why this particular oath. You don't have anything else like this in the Constitution. Any thoughts on that, Ken?
Well, I think that judges take the same oath, although I can't remember if that's spelled out in Article 3 or not, but that they will do their best to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution. One significant thing about the oath clause that has led to some debate within constitutional theory is some presidents, including Jefferson and Jackson, have relied on this to explain why they're not going to agree with the Supreme Court about certain things. Right. So for instance, Jefferson, when he was campaigning, we were talking about the campaign of when he's campaigning against his own boss, Adams, as the sitting president, one of the things that Jefferson loved to say on the campaign trail was, vote for me, don't vote for Adams, because Adams has already proved that he's completely unfit to be president because he violated his oath of office, because he's enforcing the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he's locking up people who criticize him, and that violates the First Amendment, which protects the freedom of speech. And so he's unfit for his office. Vote for me. And if I'm elected, because I will swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, that will require me to immediately give pardons to everybody that he's got convicted under that statute, because I have to exercise my powers in ways that I think are constitutional. And even though the courts maybe went ahead and, convicted those people, and the courts didn't think it was unconstitutional to do that, I have to do what I think is right. So I'm going to have to pardon them. And Lincoln made kind of similar statements about things like judicial appointments, that that the court had decided the Dred Scott decision, but he thought that was wrong, and so he would have to use his power of judicial appointments to get it overruled. He'd have to, because he has to protect and defend the Constitution, he has to appoint people to the court who would overrule wrong constitutional decisions. So that's been I think some significance of the oaths clause.
That's true. I mean, and that'll lead to other things we'll probably end up talking about, like supposed to be the individual who interprets the Constitution. And one potential view is to say interpretations of the Constitution. They're all going to be doing it. But we'll have to obviously save that for
when the word for that in constitutional theory is called departmentalism.
Yes.
Yeah. So departmentalism would be the idea that they all should do it. And most of the presidents who've subscribed to that theory have related to the oaths clause, that I take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. If the judges are attacking the Constitution, I need to protect and defend the Constitution.
In the way I view that interpretation. Exactly. Well, Ken, I think we got through Article 2, Section 1. I think that's a good place to go. And so next time we'll start into Section 2 and do that. I'm really happy for everybody who's still hanging out with us as we go through the Constitution. This has been a lot of fun.
Should we give them recommendations before we go?
Oh, we could. I don't have. Listen, I'm going to be honest right here, Ken.
Not
You're showing
today.
me.
We don't have to do it today.
Yeah. I got nothing. Yeah. Let me restart that.
Okay.
So I think we might just want to call that, the go. And so then, if you're listening to this, that means you're already a supporter of the show. But of course, there's all these different levels. So, maybe you're getting this, but you'd like to see more. Maybe you want to become a Discord supporter. And I know that Mike is going to be releasing some information about a potential way of like interacting with the show, where you're going to be asking questions and then kind of being on the show. So there's all these different levels of support. So I encourage you, even if you already are a supporter, but you're curious about some of these new things, to head to patreon.com/politicsguys or to politicsguys.com/support to see what all these different levels are so you can be a part of that. But again, thank you so much for supporting the show at the level that you do. I'm really excited to be going through this with you. That's what makes it possible for me and Ken to be here, chatting with each other and talking about this stuff. And again, we really appreciate that. Now, if you're a supporter, you already know if you've got one of those questions or comments, you don't just have to reach out to mail@politicsguys.com. You can also head to the Discord page. Love interacting with you all on the Discord page. Matter of fact, sometimes you guys get to things so quickly, I'm like, oh my goodness, I've got to... But yeah, we get on there. We've got so many different channels on that. We'd love to interact with you. But again, of course, you can always reach out to Mike at Politics Guys. And of course, again, Facebook and Twitter. You see all of these things in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Morano, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. We'll be back with a new episode this weekend. I hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,